So, Christian Friends of Israel in the UK, we have three objectives for our work. The first one is encouraging understanding, where we seek to help Christians see Israel in the context primarily of the Bible, but also in the context of history and current affairs. Secondly, we challenge prejudice in this country, working alongside the Jewish community to counter anti-Semitism. And I think many of you will be aware that anti-Semitism has surged in the last 2 years. It's becoming more and more of a problem. Then thirdly, we seek to assist the building of community in Israel by supporting some humanitarian aid projects in the land. We support 10 projects run by our sister ministry in Jerusalem, but we also support other projects run by other organisations, especially where they encourage cooperation between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis. But this afternoon I want to focus with you on encouraging understanding, because this is our primary objective in the UK. So we do it in several ways. We go out to events and conferences. So here's Sam, my colleague, and Chantal. They were at the Big Church Festival with our resources stall in August. So that's the sort of thing we go to. We brought our resources stall here to this conference as well. That's one of the ways we try to get good resources into people's hands to read about Israel in the Bible. Another one of the ways that we do it is by running an annual teaching conference here in Eastbourne each year in September. It runs through the Friday evening and then most of the day Saturday, and includes 4 teaching messages, typically 1 on the Friday evening and 3 during Saturday. And one of the things we do off the back of that is to record the teaching sessions and provide them in 3 different formats: audio CDs, DVDs, and MP4 videos on a USB memory stick. So we've got some on our stall downstairs today. This year's conference was titled "Why Israel Matters to the Church," and our guest speaker was Gerald McDermott, who is retired from his role as a professor in a Bible college, but he still teaches at the Jerusalem Seminary, as well as going out and speaking on the subject at different events. So he came and joined us on the 12th of September. Gerald, I think, was born in the 1950s, based on the date of his bachelor's degree. He's a scholar and an Anglican priest, and he's devoted much of his career to publishing and editing Christian books and articles. If you look it up, his list of publications is really quite long. He gave 3 talks at our conference this year, and the first one was titled "Why Israel Matters in the Bible." Now, I'm going deep here with this to try and give you an example of the resources that we can provide through this. And so I'm just going to run some clips for you of Gerald's talk that day and put it in context for you. Some important context as to why Israel matters in the Bible is that there are 2 opposing views that are very widespread in the church. The first opposing view is replacement thinking, where since around the 2nd century, Christians have been taught that the Christian church has replaced Israel completely in God's plans. Israel has no further role to play. The second variation is more modern. It's called fulfillment thinking, where an allegorical interpretation of all the Old Testament scriptures about Israel is used to claim that all of those promises have been fulfilled in Christ himself, and that again Israel has no further role to play. So Gerald was speaking against that background, and here as the first clip is his summary opening statement. I may need to adjust the volume quickly when this starts playing.
They have said that God changed his focus from Israel to the world, from the tiny people of the Jews to all the peoples of the world, from the tiny land of Israel to all the lands of the earth. And that while God made eternal promises in the First Testament, which some of us call the Old Testament, eternal promises about the Jewish people as his chosen people, and eternal promises about the land of Canaan being given to the Jewish people, they say, and I used to believe this because I was taught this by my professors, that he changed his mind with Jesus. When a majority of Jews in the first century failed to accept Jesus as their Messiah, they say, God changed his mind. He transferred all his promises about the Jews being his chosen people to the Gentiles, who soon became the majority of the Christian churches. And he was no longer interested in this tiny strip of land on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, but now he had the whole world in his hands.
So, very brief introduction there. Just emphasizing this point, that this theology arose because most of the Jews did not accept Jesus as their Messiah. So the thinking developed among Gentile Christians that God had switched his attention completely from the Jewish people and Israel to the Gentile Christian church, despite the fact that many of the promises we read are described as everlasting or eternal. But next comes a surprising admission by Gerald.
I used to think all this too, but then I had a wake-up call. I started to notice what was right on the surface of the text of the New Testament, but I'd never seen it, even though I was telling Noah here, I've been reading Greek for over 60 years because I went to a Jesuit high school in New York City and I was a stutterer, and the only track for stutterers was Homeric Greek. So I learned Homeric and Platonic Greek in high school, and I'd been reading, and then at the beginning of my time at the University of Chicago as a New Testament and early Christian literature major, a revival came to our Catholic Church through the Catholic Charismatic movement, and I became turned on to Jesus, and I noticed, whoa, I didn't realize this, the New Testament was written in Greek. And when I read the Greek New Testament, it was not all of it, not like Hebrews, but the Johannine literature is like baby talk. If you've learned classical Greek, it was wonderful. But I've been reading the New Testament in Greek for 25 years before I had this wake-up call. I never saw those things because I've been taught they were not there. And when you're taught that something is not there, you never see it even though it's in front of your eyes. I had been told by other scholars that neither Paul nor Jesus believed the Jews were still the chosen people, and that neither Jesus nor Paul believed in the land promise anymore, and that Israel would play no special role in the end times. I believed these scholars, who were in the majority. And so, even while reading the New Testament in Greek for 20, 30 years, I never saw these things. Until one day, they jumped off the page.
So I think Jerry raised a very interesting point there about the power of the teaching we receive initially, either as very young children or when we first become Christians. But he had this wake-up call, as he describes it, and it came through a gentleman called Baruch Kavashnikar. I'll let Jerry explain to you.
He was my guide on a church tour I was taking through Israel. And after I would give my scholarly talk at the biblical site about what this site really means and what the text here really means, he would take me aside so humbly, one-on-one, and say, Jerry, have you ever read so-and-so? I said, no, I never heard of that scholar. Have you ever seen this book? No, I didn't know that book existed. And all of a sudden I started to realize Baruch Kavaznika, some of you might know him, founding president of Jerusalem Seminary, was telling me everything I'm saying is wrong. It was very humbling. So I went back to the States and started looking up these articles and books, which led me to more articles and books, and it was a deep, deep hole. It was a wonderful hole. It was full of light. It started with reading Paul in Romans 11:28. So then when I went back and looked at Romans 11, it was totally different from what I had ever seen before, where Paul is talking about his fellow Jews who did not believe in Jesus. He said they're still beloved because of their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So God had not lost his love for them. Were they still his chosen people? Well, he just said they were still beloved. And he repeats in the next verse, the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, can never be revoked.
So a couple of early conclusions from Gerald's renewed studies after Baruch took him gently aside. The Jews are still chosen people, and the gifts and calling God placed on them cannot be taken back, cannot be revoked. He goes on to consider the gifts given to the Jews.
Now back to Romans 11:29. Paul said not only the calling of Israel as his chosen people is still in place, but so are the gifts. Now what are they? The gifts. He names them in Romans 9:4. The very first is the sonship. The Greek article is there, the. The sonship, where God told Moses to tell Pharaoh in Exodus 4:22 that Israel is my firstborn what? Son. Friends, God says here that the Jewish people are the son, singular, the son of God in a way that no other people on earth are. Look, the English people are great people, are responsible for some of the best things in Western civilization until recently. And I say the same thing for the United States. It's a wonderful people. God has done incredible things in England, but not like Israel. Nobody like Israel. This is another way of putting calling, and that's the word in verse 28. God's calling of Israel to be his firstborn son, his chosen people. Now let's go back to the gifts to Israel that Paul says are irrevocable, cannot be taken back. When Jews in Paul's day, for instance, Philo, the great Jewish philosopher, and Ezekiel, the tragedian, the playwright, and even Josephus, the great Jewish historian who was a contemporary of Paul. And many people forget, Philo and Paul were contemporaries. All of them talked about God's gifts to the Jewish people. And you know what they said? The God's principal gift to the Jewish people was the land. It was always the land. This is probably at the top of the list of what Paul meant by gifts, being irrevocable, not revoked, will never be revoked. Now Luke confirms this when he tells us in Acts 13, a passage that I had never seen before my wake-up call. And I'd read it probably hundreds of times. I just never saw it because people had told me it wasn't there. Scholars had told me it wasn't there. In Luke 13, Paul's preaching in a synagogue in Antioch of Pisidia in modern Turkey. Probably a lot of you have been there. Probably at least 2 decades after the resurrection, when Paul affirms the land promise.
So Paul affirmed the land promise by telling the people there that God had driven out the 7 nations ahead of Israel as they went into the promised land in his sermon that day. So Jerry's extended or renewed studies were leading him to more conclusions here. That the whole nation, the Jewish nation, is God's firstborn son. And it's an unusual concept for us, isn't it? A whole group of people, especially when we get the focus on Jesus as being God's beloved son. But also that the promise of the land still holds. So he next jumped forward to when he started to consider what Jesus says.
Now, what about Jesus? Did Jesus believe the Jews were the chosen people still even though he had come to be their Messiah and also Messiah to the world? There's plenty of evidence that he did. In Matthew 5, toward the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus expresses supreme reverence for Torah and the prophets. Do not think that I've come to abolish Torah or the prophets. Already when Matthew was writing, obviously there were people who did think that Jesus had come to abolish Torah and the prophets. Do not think that, though. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until... Oh, and by the way, the Greek word fulfill is a translation of a Hebrew word and concept, which the rabbis talked about for several centuries before Jesus came. They said, when the Messiah comes, he's going to give us the Messiah's Torah, the deeper interpretation of Torah. And guess what that is? Guess where we find that principally? In the Sermon on the Mount. And guess what our translation of the Messiah's Torah is? In a better translation, the law of Christ. Does that sound familiar? The law of Christ, 1 Corinthians 9. Paul tells us, Jesus came to give us the law of Christ, the Torah of the Messiah, exactly what the rabbis said that the Messiah would do when he comes. And they were preaching that for several centuries before Jesus. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, smallest letter in the Greek alphabet, you know, or a horn, chorion in Greek, the smallest stroke of the pen in Hebrew. Matthew is remembering that Jesus referred both to the Greek text and also the Hebrew text. And, you know, in the early church, their version of the Old Testament was not the Hebrew, but it was a Septuagint. And that's why so many times when you see the New Testament authors quoting the Old Testament, you look at the Old Testament and say, what? They changed it. Well, if you go to the version in the Septuagint, usually it's word for word.
So, in briefly considering some points from the Sermon on the Mount, Jerry focused on this point, and it's not just the Hebrew word behind fulfill that is important here, it's also the word behind abolish. The Jewish scholars in the years before Christ had started to use the Hebrew word for abolish to mean teaching the law incorrectly and therefore ruining it, or to teach it correctly was the word they used for fulfill, which meant fill it full of its true meaning. And that's what Christ did when he came to teach. So just brief closing comments from Jerry here.
So the next time you hear a sermon, this is my last paragraph, or read an article or a book, or hear someone preach that God changed his mind on the eternal chosenness of the Jewish people, or that God changed his mind on the gift of the land to the chosen people, please remember that these claims are not taught by the New Testament. They are not held by Jesus or Paul or Peter or John or any of the other authors. Luke, of the apostolic documents. Jesus, Peter, Paul, John, and Luke were students of the Hebrew Bible and believers in its every word. They held steadfastly to its teaching that God made an eternal covenant with the Jewish people and gave them the land of the Canaanites. Amen.
So what I've done there is shown you an example of some of our video resources for learning about this. You've seen the video image go down to a tiny part of the screen. That's where we try to put up the slides that were being shown in the conference. This year's conference had these 4 messages in it, not just why Israel matters in the Bible, but Jerry also spoke about why Israel matters in the history. Now that talk was a bit longer than an hour and absolutely loaded with important facts. Then our second guest speaker was Martin Charlesworth, who spoke about cultural progressivism, in other words, the woke movement around the world, and the associated rise of anti-Semitism. And there's a strong link between the two. And then finally, Jerry finished off with why Israel matters today, bringing things up to date. So our conference recordings include all 4 of those talks. And I would also commend to you the previous year's conference recordings, in particular, when we had Professor Stephen Notley, who was a historical geographer and was instrumental in an archaeological team finding the lost city of Bethsaida from the Gospels. And they've made some really exciting discoveries there. We've got 3 of Jerry's books on our stall downstairs. I would primarily recommend this one called Israel Matters as the easiest to read for those of us who are not theologians. Thank you very much for your attention this afternoon.